Hello, dreamers, and welcome to a new episode of Reflections with an Accent. My name is Kike Calvo, photographer and entrepreneur. Today's guest is a documentary photographer and a National Geographic Explorer. And what many of you may not know is that he was Ansel Adams' last photographic assistant. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Chris Rainier.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here, and it's good to connect again after all these years. So
I know, same here. So my first question for you, Chris, is a simple one. Why?
Well, specifically as a photographer, I think I grew up in a family full of artists, and we traveled a lot. We lived overseas. I grew up in Australia, South Africa, and when I was in my teens, we lived in London. And there were all these great museums, the Victoria and Albert, the British Museum, the Tate, all of these remarkable places to scamper along to and explore. And so my parents made a big effort of getting me out, getting me involved in seeing the great art of the 20th century. And so, like many of us, I also grew up with that shelf full of National Geographic magazines, and I literally would drag them off the shelf when I was a little wee one. And somewhere along the way, I discovered photography, and then the coin clicked. It's like, there's somebody with a camera being paid to go explore the world, to discover the world, to learn. And so, like so many of us that eventually ended up at National Geographic, there was a long road of creative evolution. And it was a real great honor and pleasure to eventually work for the institution. So why photography? I think I can best express what I feel about the world and my concerns about the world, and very specifically concerns about traditional indigenous culture and knowledge and traditions being swept away by the modernity of the 21st century, so that I want to put so many of these remarkable cultures and tribes and people on film, so to speak, as quickly as possible, because the world is changing very quickly.
It is indeed. Do you mind moving your camera so I get the upper portion of your head?
Yes. There's some windows up there, if you don't mind.
It's okay. It works. So, what has been the biggest lesson in your career?
Oh my gosh, such great questions. So many. I mean, working with Ansel Adams, I was very fortunate to be his last photographic assistant. When I joined his studio in 1980, I was very, very young, and I was just out of photographic college. And he really, so many things, but he set the tone that actually you could create art, you could create photographic art, and it could be a social tool. And there's no question the stunning images, black and white images of Ansel Adams and the landscape of Yosemite and the West, his work was very strongly used in the conservation movement, and there's no doubt that many of his images went to preserving and even creating new national parks. So the coin clicked for me is like, wow, I could actually create images and be a photographer, be a documentary photographer, and there's a possibility that you could actually make the world a better place. So that for me was a real inspiration. There's been many others, but I think that was early on one of the big ones.
So interesting. And before I pick your mind on other topics, Everybody knows Ansel Adams, right? He was renowned. But I would like to know from someone that was close to him in a moment in your life about the human being. What were some of the qualities that stood out uh, that people may not know, like from your experience working with him?
Wonderful question. And I had the opportunity to live with him. He had a compound, if you will, just south of Carmel, California, at the sort of beginning and gateway to Big Sur. So there was this beautiful view of looking down the coast towards Big Sur. And I lived in a guest cottage. He and his wife had the big house. So I, in a way, was on call 24/7 for about 5 years. And I considered it getting my PhD in a way. It really allowed me not only to sort of refine my photography, but two other things: how to make a living from photography. And then the third thing were the entourage of people that would come to visit him, some of the world's top photographers. So I got to know Sebastio Segaldo, Mary Ellen Mark, Jean Richards, Bill Brandt, the wonderful artist Georgia O'Keeffe was a dear friend of Ansel's and would come and stay. Not to mention some of the presidents. He was very good friends with Jimmy Carter and President Ford. And I really got a sense of high art, but also the passion for life, the optimism and the drive to stay deeply into your art. So I think that was a profound experience. And then Ansel in himself was very, very generous. I mean, it sometimes goes with our field photography that it's like, keep your secrets, whether it's about, the secret sauce of what cameras you use or what editing process you use, or indeed even locations. Ansel could not be more generous. His whole philosophy was about pass it on, just keep the knowledge going. And in fact, he started the very first photographic workshops, if you will, in the United States back in Yosemite in 1930s. And except for a short stop during the Second World War, the Ansel Adams workshops continued well past his death in 1984, and the Ansel Adams Gallery in Yosemite still continues to do workshops. So that whole, there are no secrets, pass it on. And then I think integrity, just the level of integrity really allowed me to see that you could have a way of life that was in a very competitive field and profession, but one with integrity.
So interesting. I'm envious of that. So what prompt your shift from working on wilderness and with Ansel Adams into focusing on endangered cultures and traditional languages? How did that happen in your own career?
Well, as mentioned, I grew up overseas, so very instrumental, pivotal experiences. My father was a geologist in an oil company, so when we were living in Australia and I was, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, we would, during the summer breaks, go out into the bush, and he would be working on an oil rig, and my brother and I would be free to roam around, and I visited traditional Aborigine villages. And then we lived in Africa and spent time with the Maasai in East Africa. And so I began to have a fascination with these traditional cultures that had been around for 10,000 generations, with rich stories, with rich traditions, with amazing regalia, and a sense of sustainability of how to live on the land. And so that kind of lodged in my inner being, if you will. And I think it sort of seems strange at first appearance that I would go from someone who was doing traditional landscape, Yosemite Valley, Big Sur, Yellowstone, to culture. But I would posture that if you look at my photographs, they really are landscapes with people in them. They're environmental portraits. And so I think the experience of working with Ansel Adams informed me of how to compose a landscape. And then my experience of going to workshops, being around people like Sebastio Segaldo and Mary Ellen Mark, Cortege, Brandt, was an understanding of how to work with people. And so the two sort of came together. And then right after I left the Ansel Adams studio, I started working with the United Nations and doing projects for the UN, for the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and doing environmental famine projects, UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, working in war zones in Cambodia and Somalia and places like that. So I was kind of combining my fascination with world politics, with culture, and with landscape.
Very interesting, and we have an audience that sometimes comes from different backgrounds. How would you define visual anthropology? What is visual anthropology for you?
That's a very, very interesting question. And, anthropology in itself is a very charged issue. And traditionally, it has been framed up in a very Western context, Western academic context, visual anthropology the same way. So the field of anthropology, visual anthropology, is going through a massive change, which is, how can I say it? It is the importance, and I believe this philosophically larger than just the field of anthropology, but just the world in general, is that the only way we're going to get close to sharing the truth, whatever the truth may be, is not excluding the many thousands of different voices around the world. Let's look at National Geographic. Traditionally, National Geographic has hired white, predominantly male, highly qualified photographers, people like Steve McCurry. You know Steve, I do. He's a wonderful person and friend. The Afghani girl, one of the classic all-time images, I think, of our lifetime. But quite frankly, I'm more interested in what the Afghani girl would do if she had a camera or if she was a storyteller, the written word. And I think, I started a program at National Geographic called All Roads. And it was a program that lasted about 15 years. And we gave grants both in still photography and video filmmaking to underrepresented First Nation cultures around the world. So we were giving grants to Aborigine filmmakers and Iranian women photographers. And I think this, in a very small way, kind of began to knock the needle at National Geographic. I'm really proud to kind of look back at that period of time, because we really made a point of taking the photographer, bringing them to Washington, D.C., and then marching them over to the National Geographic magazine and TV departments and saying, look, these are remarkable photographers and filmmakers. Think about using them. So instead of sending Steve or myself or whoever out, why not get a local perspective with a local different point of view? And I think this really is the century, if you will, that all those barriers have to break down. There's still many of them, but women, underrepresented cultures, the diversity of being able to see the world in multiple different ways. It's not just a white Western perspective. So circling it back to visual anthropology, I'm all in favor of really, opening it up to other people. My perspective as a white male is just one perspective. I want to see, what a wonderful New Guinea traditional cultural person would do if given a camera or a film camera.
Yeah, so interesting. I'm originally from Spain, and my career has gone through many ups and downs, and I'm always very linked to people from other countries and other cultures and all the things they have to go through in order to pursue their dreams. So, as we both know, the industry is different from when you started. I started later in time, but it has changed already too. What advice would you give to young photographers who aspire to work in cultural preservation or documentary photography? What would you tell them if in the future they find this video?
Well, I think it's a brilliant question, and I'll kind of use your question right at the beginning. I think one has to ask oneself why. And if you can truly understand that within yourself, then I think you're well on your way to framing up the context in which you should do the work. For me, it was always about um, archiving, and I use that very cautiously because I don't want it to appear that these are specimens of a past existence. No, this is all about archiving for the future and for being a part of the revitalization. So, getting to young students of photography and certainly visual documentation is find your passion. Don't be a generalist. Don't sort of try and figure out what that magazine or that institution wants. Just get really, really good at what you do. So, in the very beginning, I spent a year working on a portfolio of indigenous culture, and then I went to National Geographic. And then a very astute editor, photo editor, said to me, "Now go make your backyard look just as exotic." And that was a real insight to me about the importance of bringing the creative process to the table and finding a style. You know, when you look at a Nick Nichols or a Steve McCurry or a Sebastos Segaldo, you know who that person is because of their style. And I think you just have to, run 10,000 digital cards through your camera before you begin to have a style and a unique perspective. But follow your passion. Ansel Adams once said to me, put off short-term gains for long-term goals. It took me years before I worked for National Geographic. It took me years before I broke in and became a Time magazine photographer. And so, it took 10 years before things really began to click and take off. And as you say, this field goes up and down. It's going through a massive readjustment. Who knows where AI is going to take it? And that's a whole conversation we could have there. So I just believe what sustains me when the times are rough is just to believe in yourself, stay on that long-term goal. And again, for me, the long-term goal is when it's all said and done, I would love to have a digital archive of many of these visual examples of traditions that are changing quickly because of modernity. Doesn't make them less Native American or Quechua or Kayapo or any other tribe, but now, as you know, we're awash in a kind of modernity of sameness. You'll travel 3 days to go up an Amazon River, and you'll arrive at a tribe, and they all have, Michael Jackson T-shirts on. So we're changing quickly, and so for me, it's a real race against time to document the uniqueness of human existence and creativity before we visually change the world to never return to what it was.
It's a joy listening to you because in my own path, I started as an underwater photographer and then shooting nature. And many years after, I think I have come to the conclusion that I love ethnographic work and these traditions. And I can tell you that your work was an influence to me. Also, Wade Davis.
Yes.
That's how I feel about the world and things that need to be preserved. So my question goes into that direction. What does a mask representing traditional cultures? I know this is a complex question, but I know you're a smart man, and I just want to know, what do you think about this? What does a mask represent?
Exactly. Thank you for asking. And I did a book that was a culmination of probably 40 years of documenting traditional masks. It began with the first book I did, Where Masks Still Dance. Now they're cutting grass outside, so hopefully that's not a problem. So I was fascinated in this kind of regalia, this persona that separates you from the person that is wearing the mask. So I don't want to generalize because each traditional group from the continent of Africa to New Guinea to, Asia, all has different uses for the mask. But with that said, I would generally say it is a conduit that a spiritual person or a delegated person of importance wears to transcend the mortalness of human and go into the spiritual world. So it becomes a conduit for that transition. A good example of that is in Mongolia. Shamanism is still alive and still exists. Modern city people still go to the shaman to correct an illness, or if their parents are ill, to give an offering. And the shaman will go and wear a mask, and literally once they put that mask on and start doing the drumming, I have seen them transform into a completely different person in terms of their persona, and they speak in tongues. And so, our Western scientific world wants to disbelieve this. But if you think, again, of the multiple realities around the world in which people exist, it is my firm belief that that is just as legitimate as the Roman Catholic Church, as the Dalai Lama in Buddhism, or atheism, or Islam. So I am not here to judge, but merely to observe and learn along the way. I think that's the beauty of the field that we're in, like photography. It does give us permission. It legitimizes in a way, and it certainly gives us a mission to be invited into these cultures, to be able to respect it and be able to photograph it.
So interesting. And throughout your career, I believe, I hope I'm not wrong, you've authored several books. I think it's 7 or around that line. So I would like to ask you one key lesson or insight from each of them. So I'm going to tell you the title of the book, and then if you can summarize very briefly, what do you learn from it, or what is something that people should know about that work? So, Keepers of the Spirit.
I was young back then. I think there's a thread throughout all the books. The first book, Keepers of the Spirit, was really an acknowledgement of my fascination with what is sacred and what is spiritual. And so right from the get-go, having left Ansel Adams' studio, I had a day job, and then I had my art world. And Ansel Adams would often say there's assignments from outside, you have to make a living, and then there should always be assignments personally inside. And so my books have always been a personal journey. And so I went out to discover with a few cultures around the world what it meant to be spiritual, what it meant to be sacred. And I think, again, that's a theme that is run throughout all the books.
Wonderful. Where Masks Still Dance, New Guinea.
Yes. So in 1985, about a year, almost 2 years out of the Ansel Adams studio, I had an assignment in New Guinea. I'd always wanted to go to New Guinea. When I grew up in Australia, there was always exotic conversation of this island to the north of Australia where Stone Age people still live. So I wanted to go see it. So 1986, I went and had an assignment there. and absolutely fell in love with the rawness, the primordialness, the isolation, the really the existence of Stone Age culture in the 20th century. So I dedicated 10 years, 6 months of each year going to New Guinea. I systematically sort of divided the archipelago of New Guinea up into 19 parts. And again, as a visual storyteller, I was looking for visual examples. So I basically documented all the remaining Stone Age tribes, tribes that had incredible masks and costumes and tattooing. And so that took 10 years. And that really, once that book came out, I think that really kind of established me in the genre of visual anthropology, cultural documentation.
Interesting. What about, I think there was one called Ancient Marks.
Yes, so two things came out of New Guinea. Was my fascination in masks was heightened, and what I saw was traditional tattooing and body marking, the actual cutting of the skin. And so Ancient Marks was really about a 15, 20-year following the flow of traditional ink around the world. So I did my research and figured out every location around the world where traditional tattooing was going on, and where the skin is dark, it tends to be scarification, and then how it related to, at that time, in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, of the explosion of traditional tattooing being appropriated and used in Western modern culture. And so I kind of did the link. Wade very kindly wrote the essay for that and made that wonderful kind of anthropological link. But, you know, it allowed me to embed myself in the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, and really get to the tradition of traditional tattooing around the world, which of course was forbidden in as the church arrived in places like Polynesia or Africa. And so it was just going through this huge explosion in the 90s within traditional cultures of revitalizing their traditions. In fact, just a week and a half ago, I was up in Canada, up in a place called Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte's, and a lot of the young people are beginning to do the traditional tattooing on their face again, as the Polynesians are doing in places like New Zealand with the mocha. So that book was a real exploration of that. And my publisher has asked me to kind of update it. So I'm spending the next 2 years kind of going to some other areas that I hadn't before, bringing the book up to sort of 2026.
Very interesting, Chris. What did you learn from Cultures on the Edge?
Cultures on the Edge was a book that was sort of, I don't want to say retrospective, because that's usually when someone passes away. So I want to say a mid-career. So I sort of took a lot of material that I'd never published before and created a wonderful relationship with a Chinese publisher, and I put them together with National Geographic. So National Geographic published that book, Cultures on the Edge. And I was really referring with that title of cultures not on the edge of going away, but cultures on the edge of a massive transformation. Our culture is going through a massive transformation. So too are many traditional cultures. You know, I was in Mongolia a couple years ago, about 8 years ago, 5 days from the road. We were up with eagle hunters, the wonderful Cossack eagle hunters in the western part of Mongolia. And I was setting up a shot with this very handsome eagle hunter. He had his eagle. The sun was sort of beginning to set. And how I often work is I'll take an iPad and photograph my models and then show them the iPad. So it begins to break the ice. So after I took a photograph of him, he sort of, through the translator, said, "Oh, I'd like that image. I'd love to get a copy." So I started to bring out my notepad and pen, from underneath his Cossack jacket, he pulled out his iPhone and said, "No, just airdrop it to me and I'll put it on Facebook." And that is where culture is now. This massive culture's on the edge of a transformation. Just because he is on Facebook and has the latest iPhone doesn't mean that he's losing his culture. I think that's the beautiful thing of what's happening here in the 21st century, is that you can still be a traditional Kayapo or a New Guinea chief in the middle of the jungles of New Guinea and still have modern technology. The two aren't exclusive to each other.
Wonderful, Chris. So I think this recording will interrupt. So what I will do, I will stop and create a new one so we can finish the interview properly. I know you have to go at that time, but we still have some time. So what have you learned from your last book, Mask?
Well, there's a couple new books out after that, but Mask for me was really a celebration. I mean, there's always Mask 2, 3, and 4. There's no way when you tackle the world, and you know this in the subjects that you love, is that you could go on and spend your entire life. And of course, a book comes out, you do a lecture tour, and then there's always someone that comes up to you and goes, "Wow, you didn't photograph this remarkable mask that is in Zimbabwe and Africa." And it's like, no, I didn't know about it. So since Mask has come out, since many books, the ancient marks, I just want to go back out and do it all over again. So what I've learned is that it's not the end all. I'm going to run as fast as I can until I keel over, and hopefully I'll keep going into my 90s and 100s. Who knows where photography is then?
Had to highlight 5 lessons. What would they be?
Wow, I think so early on in my career, right sort of as I was finishing working at the Ansel Adams studio. It was a very stressful time. Ansel had just passed away, clearly the end of an era. We were trying to wrap up his immense archive and get it to where it was destined, which is the Center of Creative Photography in Tucson, Arizona. I took a trip to Ladakh in India, which is on the Tibetan Plateau, and loved Tibetan Buddhism. I eventually went back there to spend 4 months living in a monastery for the purpose of photographing monastic life, if you will. And I really fell in love with the philosophy, and I feel it's, for me, a philosophy, not a religion, of Buddhism. That sense of compassion, that sense of nothing is forever. And I think for me, that has been so important to embrace, because as you know, our photographic field, even the National Geographic, is completely changed from when we used to work there. So holding on to something that eventually will pass away will set yourself up for regret and unhappiness. So I think for me, the big lesson that I try and hold on to is that sense of karma, integrity that I learned from Ansel Adams. And truly, as you get older, and as Leonard Cohen says, you ache in all the places you used to play, is that life is precious. It's not there forever, and seize the moment. This time on this planet is so short, and especially with the race against time in terms of pristine wilderness areas changing, traditional cultures changing, I feel a sense of urgency, but a sense of calm, of taking it all in. And in a way, Buddhism also, this is a kind of unusual thought, teaches you that it's just information. Don't get upset about it. It's just information. Whatever comes at you, and keep your eye on the prize.
And what would you do differently if you could go back in time? Would you change anything?
Actually, not. Well, and it ain't over yet. I always wanted to be an astronaut, but we live in this remarkable time where I am determined that my son and I are going to be the first father and son in space. So,
Well, Chris, let me tell you something. I recently interviewed Barbara Barrett. I don't know if
okay,
you know her. She was the former U.S. secretary. She did the full training for the astronaut program past her 60s.
fantastic.
So
There's
like,
hope.
there's an interview there. So I'm just saying, like, you never know when things can happen.
Absolutely. And, I'm working very hard. I'm involved with a couple of projects with Richard Branson. So I'm delicately waiting for the right moment to go. So, Richard, Sir Richard, how about my son and I going to space? So that's the only regret. And I don't regret it because I'm still young enough that I'm going to get into space. And, again, along with the Buddhist sort of train of thought, no point having regrets. It clogs up your ability to be truly present in the moment and what you want to do into the future.
So you just gave me another question. I think you know that I write children books. There's more than 22 now in 23 languages, and the whole thing was inspired by my two daughters. So my question for you is, what have you learned by being a dad?
Ah, well, there's nothing like it. I think I've taken my son on not a lot of trips, but certainly a fair amount of trips. Obviously, he's had school, so we've gone to Antarctica, we've gone to Iceland, to the Galapagos. We're going to take a trip probably down to Peru this summer as he graduates from high school. I think there's nothing greater than having a child, learning. It demands of you to be self-reflective and to learn from your mistakes, and also eventually to set them free. I mean, he's 18 years old, and he's like that the young bald-headed eagle in the nest that's flapping its wings and about to take off, and truly excited about supporting him. So I think my life would be a mere shadow of what it could be or would have been without him in it. In other words, it's been such a joy. Now, the responsibility is tough too, because as a photographer, you're gone a lot. And so, in a way, he and I are getting closer and closer and closer now in this kind of transition from him being a young man into an adult. And we have many trips planned to do together.
Wonderful. And can you think of a big failure that later became your greatest success?
Ah, well, yes, I think I often wonder if I had have gone to New York and, gone to the International Center of Photography and majored in photojournalism and documentary work. But that regret is not really a regret because I ended up going to Brooks Institute of Photography in Santa Barbara, which in retrospect, many of the skills that I learned, like wedding photography and still life photography and studio photography, really wasn't my passion. But it put me in a position to be in California and to decide to go to the Ansel Adams workshop. And there's no question that move, however intentional or accidental it was, changed my life and allowed me to kind of turbocharge some of the dreams that I had. So no regrets, just curiosity of different directions to go in. And, life, I always believe if you have intention and you're passionate, life will just keep putting the right things in front of you.
So interesting. You're making me smile because I arrived to New York City in my 20s and I always wanted to study in ICP and I never did.
Yes.
And,
Well, it turned out okay for you and I, so it's okay.
but an interesting thing is that years later, I brought Alison Morley and I think five other instructors to Colombia to an event that we did down there. So
Fantastic.
you never know how life is gonna work. Can you name three people that have changed your life?
So when we lived in England and I was in my teens, my great aunt, a woman named Chris Rainier, the sort of French pronunciation of Rainier, and she was a remarkable, very well known. She eventually was knighted as a dame in the British Empire for her music, and she was a composer. And so she moved in remarkable circles. There were a number of very respected artisans living in London and England in the 1970s. Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, other individuals like that were writers, musicians, sculptors, painters. And she would have these little sort of events, like a salon, if you will, over at her little humble apartment on Sundays. So I had the opportunity, I was 12, 13, 14, to go to these, and I was just like a little fly on the wall. And so this group of people just changed my world. And that was a really profound experience having her in my life. I would say also, no question, Ansel Adams. And thirdly, I would say my son. I think if you slow down and you get out of the way of trying to be a parent, there's a lot of wisdom in these young people that are bombarded with so much information. And I think their conviction to um, get us out of the way and try and save the planet, there's some wisdom there. And I always have to remind myself to be quiet and listen more than talk.
Hmm. And we are all in permanent evolution, right? I have a presentation called Evolution, and I always touch on this topic. Always learning, always changing based on experiences, interactions. What would Chris of today tell the Chris in his 30s?
Oh, move faster. The time changes. I'm I've always been someone moving very fast, and I think I think the privilege of working for Ansel, and he was 84 when he passed away, literally on the day of the evening that he passed away, I was bringing prints to him. He was making, in the hospital, he was making choices. And I remember sort of as I was packing up to leave and telling him, I hope he feels better, he said, where have all the years gone? Where has all the time gone? I barely got started. Now, here's a man who got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He helped the Sierra Club, was the president of the Sierra Club, no question, helped save many of the national parks that we have in North America, created an amazing body of photographic work, started the photo department at the Museum of Modern Art. The list goes on and on and on. And yet at 84, he was saying, where did all the time go? And for a 19, 20-year-old, sort of sitting at the foot of the guru, so to speak, that really went inside. And I think that has always, always inspired me. And, like I said earlier, keep your eye on the prize, put off short-term gains for long-term goals. That has always been an inspiration that, don't stop, keep going, not just to cover the territory, but learn along the way. But once we move into the afterworld, so to speak, we'll have all the time in the world to think about what we should have done. So I want to have as little regrets as possible.
So interesting, Chris. I don't know if you know, I have a project called Dreams of the World. It's a,
Mm,
it's a video project, and I've been asking people around the world what is their dream. Uh,
fantastic.
we have surpassed almost 3 million views already in YouTube. But the other day, I was working in Spain and I came across Cristina Garcia Rodero from
Oh,
Magnum. And
wow.
and randomly we met. We knew of each other, but we never met physically. We were photographing the same thing, and she became uh, part of my project. And I asked Christina, "What is your dream?" And like you just mentioned, she came back to me and said, "I just want to have enough time to finish all the projects
Yes.
and all the work that I'm working on." So her dream was time. So that's yeah, that kind of shocked.
Wonderful story.
Yeah.
Wonderful. It's
So
so important. I will just say I love the Bob Dylan quote. Those busy, what is it? Those busy not being born are busy dying. And I think, it's so important. Just keep yourself active, keep yourself alive, keep moving, no regrets, keep learning, and everything tends to work out okay.
and I know you have to go quickly or soon, but can you tell me something about yourself that not many people know? Like everybody knows your name, your work, but behind the scenes, tell me
Uh,
something about Chris that very little people know, if you're willing to share, right? And
I've
something that won't close my YouTube account too, right? So,
no worries, no worries. Well, gosh, one of the things I always love to say is when I went to Brooks Institute, which was in Santa Barbara, California, was that I majored in surfing and I minored in photography. And so I am passionate about surfing, but now living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is up in the high Sierras, um, or the high desert rather, and the end of the Rockies as it comes down through Colorado, sort of ends in New Mexico. Anyways, there's tons of high mountains, and I try and go skiing every single day I'm home. And where my partner Olivia and I live is actually up on the mountain, and we're about 15 minutes from the ski hill. So I get up super early. I've got, conference calls at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock and at 8 o'clock because we run a foundation that's global. So we're up at all hours. But that 6:30 to midday, nobody touches it because I come out on our deck. I look up at the ski hill, call my brother who lives in town and says, "Snow looks good," and we go skiing. And so I will literally sometimes come racing down the hill, kind of be taking off my ski clothes as I'm opening up the Zoom for a call to a client or National Geographic or somebody else. So I've got this secret life that I love.
so interesting, so interesting. So I'm gonna wrap up the interview here. When we finish, I would like to stay 2 minutes with you to ask you a couple of questions off the
Absolutely.
record. But I see this show, Reflections with an accent, as a time capsule, right?
Mm.
And I always finish all my communications, my emails, with an expression that is been part of myself, my career, and how I see life, which is never stop dreaming. So I always ask everybody that comes through this show to express what is never stop dreaming to themselves. Like if you had to address an audience and tell them what is to never stop dreaming, what Chris Rainier would say.
Wonderful. Beautiful question. I think the world has an immense amount of pressure on it. We're going through this remarkable transformation. The politics of not only the United States, but many parts of the world is changing, seems to be outdated. We're Mercury, when it breaks up, it's very chaotic, and then it's somehow another comes back together again. And I think we're going through this massive change in the planet, and the pressure on young people, the pessimism that's out there. And for me, it's so important to keep one's own personal dream alive. A Buddhist monk once said to me, "Remember to breathe, the rest is easy." And I love that kind of simplicity of just stay in the light. And sometimes it's hard. You get banged down and, people say, no, you can't do it, but just believe in yourself, breathe, and then keep your fire and your dream alive. And I'm taking my 18-year-old son to places that have changed. So, 20 years ago, when I went to a particular tribe, they were in regalia, they believed in their culture, and now it might have changed. Maybe it's transformed completely. What I have to do is keep quiet and let my son discover that world now in the 21st century. And I think as you get older, that becomes more challenging. But I think keeping in the dream, and I talk to a lot of traditional elders, and I'll say, "Oh, we've got to survive this climate change. What are we going to do?" And they go, "What? Wait a minute! Don't talk about survival. Talk about a planet that is returned to abundance, that still has the water running through the creeks that you can drink it, the air that you can breathe that is not polluted." And it begins to transform the way you look and the way you dream and the possibility of the future. I just had a wonderful opportunity to interview Jane Goodall for a book called The Future of Exploration that has just come out. And her essay is about the future of hope. Now, here's someone who has seen the chimpanzee community decimated in Tanzania, all sorts of conservation issues alive and fiery in her world. But she says the future is about hope. If we let go of hope, then it's all over.